conformément à l'article
Pursuant of Section 108(3)G of the Standing Orders, the committee meets today in the context of 2024 reports from the Auditor General's Office of Canada for reports 2 to 4.
Canada, Mélanie Joannis, Director, David Norman, Principal, Glenn Wheeler, Principal. Appreciate you all coming in here today. I know, Ms. Hogan, you have opening remarks, and the floor is now yours, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am pleased to be here today to discuss 3 reports that were just tabled in the House of Commons. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Ce lieu est aussi appelé Ottawa.
This area is also known as Ottawa. I express my gratitude and respect to all Indigenous peoples who have contributed to shaping and safeguarding the beautiful lands they call home throughout Canada. I'm accompanied today by Glenn Wheeler, David Normand, and Mélanie Joannis, who are responsible for the audits. 2 of the audits I will be discussing today focus on programs supporting Canada's Indigenous peoples. The third, which I will cover first, examined the design and implementation of the National Trade Corridors Fund. This fund is intended to improve the movement of goods across the country by strengthening the network of roads, rails, airports, and seaports. Fluid and resilient transportation systems help foster trade through imports and exports and contribute to Canada's economic health.
Canada did a good job of designing and implementing the fund. The department gathered and used evidence on the status and performance of transportation corridors to identify bottlenecks and other fluidity constraints. This evidence-based approach supported the selection of projects that would address known gaps in the infrastructure. However, because of weaknesses in Transport Canada's monitoring and reporting on performance, it was unclear whether projects were having the intended impact. Infrastructure programs like the National Trade Corridors Fund take years to produce results. This time factor makes it all the more important to have a robust system to track performance so that Transport Canada can show the extent to which the funds have contributed to improving the fluidity of Canada's transportation infrastructure. Je vais passer maintenant à nous.
Turning now to our audits of programs intended to support Canada's Indigenous peoples. The first focused on housing in First Nations communities. We found that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation had made little progress in supporting First Nations to improve housing conditions in their communities. Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation are responsible for working with First Nations to meet their housing needs by 2030. Over the past 5 years, they have spent close to $4 billion to build new homes, repair existing ones, and increase First Nations' capacity to manage housing. We found that in 2023, 80% of needs were still not met. The percentage of homes that need major repairs or replacement remains largely unchanged, despite the effort that has gone into building and repairing homes.
Nations had estimated that $44 billion was needed to improve housing in First Nations communities, and the needs continue to grow. We found that the department and the corporation had not prioritized communities with the greatest needs. First Nations communities with the poorest housing conditions received less funding than communities of the same size with better housing conditions. Mold in First Nations homes is a long-standing health hazard, and we found that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation still do not know the magnitude of the problem. In fact, the department and corporation are currently not following the strategy that they developed in 2008 to address this problem, and neither could explain why the strategy was no longer in use. There is no plan in place to tackle this issue. This is the fourth time since 2003 that we are raising the alarm about unsafe and unsuitable housing in First Nations communities. Adequate housing is a basic human need. And after 4 audit reports, I can honestly say that I am completely discouraged that so little has changed and that so many First Nations individuals and families continue to live in substandard homes. The findings in our last audit report on the First Nations and Inuit policing program are equally concerning. Overall, we found that neither Public Safety Canada nor the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, worked in partnership with Indigenous communities to provide community-based proactive policing services. They did not collect enough information to know whether the program was achieving its intended results, including whether the requirements set out in policing agreements were being met. Notre dernier audit de ce programme.
We last audited this program in 2014, 10 years ago, and again this time we found critical shortcomings in how it is being managed. While funding has significantly increased over the last 10 years, we found that $13 million of funds related to the 22-23 fiscal year went unspent. This is concerning in the context of a program intended to support the safety of Indigenous communities. We found that Public Safety Canada did not have an approach to allocate funds equitably to communities. The department told us that it relied on the province's or territories' readiness to fund their share of the program and on past funding received by communities to determine the amounts allocated.
And partnership with communities. For example, many agreements are automatically renewed with terms of 10 to 15 years. This means that engagement with communities can be deferred for a very long time. We also found that because of staffing shortages over the past 5 years, the RCMP has been unable to fully staff the positions for which it receives funding under the program's agreements. This leaves First Nations and Inuit communities without the level of proactive and community-focused policing services that they should receive. Time after time, whether in housing, policing, safe drinking water, or other critical areas, our audits of federal programs to support Canada's Indigenous peoples reveal a distressing and persistent pattern of failure. The lack of progress clearly demonstrates that the government's passive, siloed approach is ineffective and, in fact, contradicts the spirit of true reconciliation. A fundamental shift is urgently needed to drive significant progress in providing proper support to Indigenous families and communities across the country, especially those most in need who currently are too often left behind.
By failing to take meaningful action to achieve a full transfer of authority and determination to First Nations, the federal government's approach is not aligned with delivering on its commitments to support the self-determination of Canada's Indigenous peoples. It's important to understand that these are not legacy issues that live in the past. They are ongoing and perpetual, with direct consequences that people experience on a daily basis, and they stand in contradiction to Canada's commitments to truth and reconciliation. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening statement, and we would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you. We thank you.
A lot to consider, Ms. Hogan. Turning now to our first round, we have Mr. Nader for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Auditor General Hogan, and your team for joining us this morning and for these audits. I want to pick up on something that you mentioned in your opening comments, and again is mentioned in the report about the 2008 mold strategy that is apparently no longer being followed. And you mentioned that neither department could indicate why or for what reason that was stopped being followed. Do you have an indication of when that seemed to occur, and any speculation as to why that simply ceased to happen?
So as I've mentioned, we've done 4 audits on housing in First Nations community, and a recommendation to develop a strategy to address mold issues across First Nations and communities came from our 2006 audit. When we did a follow-up in 2008, we saw that the mold strategy wasn't being completely followed. In 2011. When we did a follow-up in 2011, we saw that it wasn't being completely followed. So it's been since then. Our audit started in 2018. You need this strategy and a plan to know how to address the problem. But what's even more concerning is that neither the department nor the Crown Corporation could tell us the magnitude of the problem. And if you want to be able to properly finance and fund and support communities to address it, you first need to understand the magnitude, gather that information, and then have a plan to fund it and tackle it.
And then to follow up on that exact point, you note in 2.29 that only one of the regional offices was actually collecting data on this matter. Going beyond that, how much of a concern is there about data collection beyond simply this issue, but around other issues more generally, that the data isn't being collected from communities across the country, not only just on mold, but on other issues as well?
Well, I would tell you that that's a common finding we have in both the policing report as well as the housing report, is that there isn't data being gathered. And when you contrast it to the National Trade Corridors report that we also released today, you'll see that there was data used to make well-informed decisions. And that's really what's needed to help support First Nations communities. But I would tell you that there's, in the area of capacity, is another place where Indigenous Services Canada had not been gathering the data, and it was only recently that they surveyed many communities to find out if they had a housing manager who could help support them to understand and manage their housing issues across their community. And very few communities responded. And even then, it was clear that smaller communities were less likely to have a dedicated resource or the capacity to apply for funding, and even to help identify the extent of problems like houses in need of repair or mold in those communities.
And to that end, Section 2.37 notes that, I'm quoting here, we found that among communities of similar sizes, communities with the poorest housing conditions received less targeted funding than those with better housing, which certainly seems contradictory to what one might expect or hope to see in that situation. And again, following up, would you attribute some of that to that lack of capacity, lack of a housing manager, lack of infrastructure on the ground in terms of how that funding gets allocated?
Mm-hmm. Well, the way the program is structured is that a First Nations community has to apply for funding. So if you're less likely to have a housing manager or have awareness of funding programs there, you're not going to apply, so you're going to receive less. And we actually targeted and looked at some of the smaller communities with less than 100 housing units, and we found that when a community had self-assessed that more than 75% of their homes were in need of repair or replacement, those communities on average received less money than those who had better housing conditions. And that kind of analysis of the data is not being done by Indigenous services. And really, they don't understand the needs of all the communities. So, it really does start, a well-informed decision starts with gathering data from everyone and then making your funding allocations accordingly.
Yeah, and I certainly think that's a theme that we're seeing kind of throughout the report, is that need to gather data. I think I have time for
You've got 90 seconds.
90 seconds is lots of time. I want to follow up on, again, using old information, old data. And in 2.33, you note that we found the CMHC relied on data from Canada's 2001 census in its formula for allocating annual funding to its regional offices for its First Nations new and home repair loan program. 2001 was certainly a long time ago, and it's somewhat concerning that data from so long ago is being used to inform decisions here in, well, I guess, 2023, but into 2024 from when the audit was completed. So a kind of two-part question. First, why do you see that as a concern that such old data is being used? And second, if you could speculate as to why CMHC may have been using data from over 20 years ago to make its decisions on this matter.
So CMHC uses a funding allocation program to allocate their funds to their regional offices and provinces. Using old data, 2001 census data hasn't kept up with changes in the population for many, many years. And when CMHC updated their analysis by using the most current 2021 census data, what they discovered was that some provinces had been underfunded over the years, and other provinces had been overfunded for the years. The Crown Corporation couldn't tell us why. My take on likely one of the reasons why would be that it would mean perhaps removing funding, historical funding given to a community in order to fund another based on the fact that population growth or people have moved in different provinces versus others. So I think it's an excellent question to ask the Crown if you have the opportunity.
Thank you, and I'm sure we will. Turning now to Mr. Chen, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Auditor General for this report. In your report, you indicate a number of facts and findings, one of which is that there was no meaningful improvement in housing condition for First Nation communities from the period between 2015 and 2022. You indicate that the percentage of homes in need of major repairs decreased from 20.8% to 19.7%, but the homes that needed to be replaced increased from 5.6% to 6.5%. So this to me would indicate that there are more prohibitive to repair homes versus those that need general repairs that are receiving at least percentage-wise more repairs. So can you shed further light onto why there are more homes that cannot be replaced, yet there seems to be more homes that are receiving repairs?
So I might ask Mr. Wheeler to add in on the split, but I guess what I would offer up first is, back in 2021, the Assembly of First Nations with Indigenous Services Canada developed an estimate of what it would cost to repair and replace homes to help close the housing gap in First Nations communities. And they didn't have a plan, however, over the years to determine how they would fund that. Right? So they've spent $4 billion over the last 5 years, but without having a plan, you don't know how you're going to finance this investment going forward and making the decision between, allocating your funding for repairs and renovations. So I don't know if, Glenn, you'd like to add anything to that?
Mr. Chair, maybe just a point of clarification on Exhibit 2.4. I think perhaps a better way to look at it would be the variation between 5.6 and 6.5 in terms of housing needing to be replaced. Those are houses that are beyond the point where undertaking repairs would be economically feasible and allow people to continue to live in the homes, whereas the 20.8 to 19.7% change is reflecting housing in need of major repairs. So those houses are houses that still can be lived in, but they need major repairs to roofs or flooring or foundations. So it's not really. It doesn't make sense to compare sort of the two. They're two different things. But the larger issue, why you don't see an improvement perhaps, is that even though, for example, over 11,000 new houses have been built, or in the process of being built in the period under which we took our audit, as time goes by, houses that perhaps were in need of major repairs but were not repaired, then they are no longer, you can no longer live in them. So there's a bunch of different things happening which lead to the trend you see in our report, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So, the Auditor General makes a number of recommendations in this report, and I could not help but note in reading the report that the responses from the various departments were in agreement to the Auditor General's recommendations, with the exception of recommendation found in paragraph 2.39, which says Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation should work with the First Nations communities with the poorest housing conditions to ensure that they receive the support they need to improve housing conditions. The report indicates here that the response of each entity was partially agreed. Auditor General, are you satisfied that there is only partial agreement with your recommendation? And could you tell us a bit more about what you heard back?
So obviously, no, I'm not satisfied that they've partially agreed. We think that our recommendation is one that would improve the situation for First Nations communities within the current policy framework. The department and CMHC disagreed with us because they feel that the program is one of applying for funding. So it is up to communities to identify their needs and then submit an application to receive the available funding. It is our view that when you have a capacity issue and some communities are unable to apply, then those who are likely in the greatest need or have the poorest housing conditions aren't accessing the funding. Our recommendation was about improving access and creating awareness that funding exists to help support communities to address mold problems or to replace or build homes. It isn't about being passive. It's about recognizing that some communities need different support, might need to be aware of a program and apply for it, whereas others communities are more self-sustaining and can apply without the support of the department. So it's about tailoring that approach instead of just saying, well, the program is an application one, please identify your needs and apply.
Based on your experience and expertise that you have developed in examining a wide range of different programs across different government departments, what types of initiatives could the departments employ to be more proactive, to reach out to communities that don't have the capacity to access funding for housing? Could you elaborate on your knowledge on this area?
Well, I think it would start with, first off, being aware of which communities aren't applying or don't have the capacity. If you look at many of our previous reports, whether it be about water or emergency preparedness or here housing and policing, they're all programs that require communities to apply. For example, the CMHC housing programs, there are 13 different programs that a community would have to figure out which 13 they may be eligible for and apply individually to each of them. That is very complex if you don't have a dedicated housing manager. But in my view, this approach that the government is using is one that is passive and siloed, that hasn't been working over the last 2 decades. It's been 20 years that we have been looking at housing. And it's time for a fundamental shift in how the Indigenous Services Canada approaches these types of programs with communities if the goal is really to support them in self-determination. They need the knowledge and the awareness and the authority to have access to the funding, and some communities just need more help in knowing about the programs existing.
Thank you, and that is your time, Mr. Chen. Turn now, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés. Vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have the floor for 6 minutes, Madame Sinclair Desgagnés. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Auditor General of Canada for these 3 reports. 2 are, no surprises and are devastating. Now, in a general way, and we heard it earlier, but it's been 2 decades, then we've seen little or no progress, whereas the situation is more than alarming on reserves. And I would like to hear you more. Of course, we heard you a little bit earlier about your thinking on this, but what is the problem? Is it incompetence at the federal government level or a lack of will? We do have to adopt a new approach, but how to adapt the approach quickly?
Mon avis, c'est
In my opinion, policies and practices at present have not kept up with the evolving policies of federal government. So there is truth and reconciliation, and there is self-determination. Fundamentally, you need changes to structures. When you talk about policies, are you talking about the Indian Act and the promises made at the time of Confederation, or are you talking about more recent policies? Because, yes, there have been more recent promises. Even some 10 years ago, there's strategies going back to 2003, or 2008, but they have not been respected. People don't even know why. There's so many things, public safety, or in housing, or in construction of housing. It all comes from a much deeper problem, and that's what I'm asking. What is the federal government doing or not doing or deciding not to do, which should be done? So I come back to, is it lack of competence, lack of goodwill? The design of programs when it comes to housing, and even the Indigenous policing, community policing programs go back to 96. Transport Canada talked about outdated policy and it not being flexible policy. So the departments are well aware that their processes and their policies need to be worked on. They are not working. Now, the passive approach, which is we're going to wait until the communities actually want to support them in self-determination. We're going to wait for them to apply when they don't even have the capacity to be able to do the applying. I mean, it's a breach of dialogue. You need to know what communities need to make progress. Earlier, you mentioned that there needs to be a change. Everyone understands it's not working. No one here would dare to say that it's going to end up by working. I can think back, you can't do things again and again and expect there to be a change. So you talked about a need in a comprehensive approach at the federal level. Can you speak to this further? Well, my mandate cannot touch on government policies. I can only examine the public services and the approaches taken. Now, the approach that is being used in support of self-determination and reconciliation is taking a step back to not impose anything on Indigenous communities. But the smallest communities that don't have the capacity or may not even be aware of programs are not helped by that. So by not changing the way of doing things, we're not changing the approach, you're not going to help these communities. But of course, policies need to be updated and, be hand in hand with government pledges. So in the report, we see that Quebec is doing a little bit better in terms of the proportion of housing that needs to be replaced or repaired. Quebec seems to be a little better off. Why would that be? I think it's a difficult issue, and it all depends. I mean, there are certain programs that have funding with provinces and territories. And when it comes to policing programs, of course, that is in step with provinces and territories' priorities. But there's limited money allocated to the provinces, and then it also depends on communities to be able to hold their hand up and apply for money. And Quebec Indigenous communities and BC Indigenous communities are larger and have more capacity to put in the applications. Then there is building capacity within Indigenous communities. If we want Indigenous communities to be able to organize themselves and be able to apply for federal government, you have to build capacity at the level of the communities so that they can then organize themselves. In Quebec, there's a funding ecosystem that's developed through SOCA and MACA. You can see those organizations that are there that are helping communities. I'm thinking of credit unions for local economic development. I know that's not the purpose of the audit, but I think it would be an important aspect to examine the impact that these types of organizations can have. And it might explain the differences that we see in Canada and between certain provinces, that some are managing better. Your question? Your time is running out. Well, in terms of funding for housing, Ms. Hogan, and subsequent to your audit, could this be a potential solution to help some Indigenous nations? Well, if there are organizations that can help First Nations communities who have a better opportunity or better success. We haven't done an audit of all those. We can only do the federal government. But see, if the Indigenous Services Canada can prioritize capacity building, that is to create capacity in a community will help with self-determination. Rather than just give them money today to fund a given issue of the day. It's the long-term focus that is best. Thank you very much. Next.
You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Auditor General for this important report. We're experiencing the consequences of systemic racism. It's clear we've had decades now of consecutive governments that have led to the Auditor General's comments this morning. How irresponsible consecutive governments can be to lead to the death of individuals because they're First Nations. That is ultimately the discussion we're having today. The consequence of not having houses in northern Alberta and living outside in -50 weather is death. The numbers coming out of Alberta, for instance, in just the city of Edmonton was over 3,000 individuals were houseless, an increase that was larger and paled in comparison to every year prior. These kinds of continuous lack of care, lack of responsibility, and lack of trust continues to placate Canadian society. I'm disturbed by the findings of the Auditor General. I want to thank her team for conducting such a report and the decades-long work of the Auditor General's office to continuously raise the alarm. I've been here now just over 2 years, and the amount of reports we've seen with the failure of Indigenous Services Canada to provide the kind of quality homes, to provide the kind of quality living that Canadians expect to live in is just not there. And there is a huge systemic problem where the Auditor General, in just a few months from now, will come back to this table to speak about another atrocity that continues with this government's endless ignorance of systemic racism within Indigenous Services Canada. And what we'll see is perhaps another decade of policy that continues to result in the deaths of my relatives. It's simply unacceptable. We need accountability. We need change. And I need my colleagues to be serious about this, to understand this. That this is the most fundamental issue in our society. That if we can't actually help those that we've come into treaty with, what kind of country is Canada? We are not honorable partners. We're failing. And we've been failing for generations. It's just not acceptable. The fact that in Alberta, if we turn our attention to page 2 of the report on inequitable funding for communities with the poorest housing conditions, point 2.34, according to an analysis by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation in 2023, the impact of not updating its formulas resulted in First Nations in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba being significantly underfunded and therefore not receiving their equitable share of funding. For example, in 2022, the Alberta region received about $19 million in funding, which is pennies. Had the formula been updated to use recent census data, the region would have received about $35 million. The corporation determined that the region had been underfunded by more than $140 million from the period of 2008-9 to 2022-23. How a cabinet minister could sit around a table and approve a budget without even asking the question as to how the condition of their number one partner is supposed to be, what kind of government do we have? A government that doesn't care, is benefiting from the systemic racism that they've inherited, and are complicit in the deaths of my relatives. It's not acceptable. I know that as soon as I'm done here today in this discussion, this topic will continue to not be discussed. It'll continue to be pushed under the rug. Ministers will continue to say that they did a real good job. The opposition will continue to move on in their schedules, and Indigenous people will be left without a home at the end of all of this. Who benefits and who loses from these continuous decisions that hurt communities? The fact that since 2001, we've been using a 2001 census for the formula for Indigenous communities. How unfair is that? Like, someone has to be held responsible for this. Someone has to apologize. Someone has to take accountability for such gross neglect. Simple neglect has resulted in a major catastrophe. The fact that we couldn't even update a formula to provide equity for my region in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, one of the most simplest things you can do. Just look at the formula and make sure it's updated. That wasn't done. What gross neglect this is. In addition to the fact that we have the lack of knowledge of smaller communities of these programs. How are they expected to provide the kind of cooperation to the government when the government's the one sitting on their hands, waiting for someone to put their hand up and say, yeah, that issue I told you about in the 1980s, even stemming further, but it's still going on. The mold, the collapsed houses, the lack of clean water, yeah, that's still happening. Why is it they have to continuously say that every fiscal year to get to the same fact? Communities are running out of time. They're running out of resources, and they're running out of hope.
Mr. Digilate, you're almost out of time. Do you have a question for the auditor? I don't want to cut you off, but
I don't have any questions,
okay,
Mr. Chair, because it's very clear to me that the Auditor General understands this issue, this systemic issue that's present to Canadians. I want to see accountability. I need to see our colleagues join across party lines to get to the bottom of this. We need to have accountability, and we need clarity as to what we tell those folks who have no home or have lost their home or have no hope of ever getting one. When we don't supply support for First Nations communities at home in their communities, they end up in urban centers.
And
they end up in a tragedy.
We will come back to you shortly.
Mr. Chair, I'll continue on in my responses, but I just want you to know that I hope that we have support from this in our committee to look and investigate this issue seriously and get to the bottom of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Beginning our second round, Mr. Vierson, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Most of my questions will be around the National Trade Corridors Fund report from the Auditor General, and I want to thank the Auditor General for being here today. One of the interesting things around the report is generally okay. You say that they're doing a reasonable job in assessing the need and making good decisions on where to go with it. We're just not getting a follow-up at the end. One of my criticisms of this government is that they generally make their measure of success how much money they spend on a project or on anything, but not whether we get any result for this. And this seems to be another one of those cases. Would you agree with that, or would you say they are getting the results. We're just not managing it to measure it essentially.
Well, I would offer up that this program has committed almost $4 billion to infrastructure projects to help the fluidity and resiliency of transportation corridors, but very few has been spent so far. Only around 700 million or so it's about 20%. There are very few projects, I think only 30 that have been completed out of 181 that have been approved so far. So it is still early days. What we did find when it came to results measurement was that Transport Canada did not include good measures to look at outcomes. They were really measuring what I'll say are outputs, number of roads or an extra port added. And they recognize that and actually have designed new measures for outcome. They're using them now in some of the newer agreements that are signed. The most recent 9 agreements include those new ones. But it's not too late to go back and make sure that going forward, Transport Canada gathers the information to know whether or not the funds invested will actually improve the fluidity of the corridors. And these projects are lengthy. And so it will also take time to show those results. So you need to track trends over many years, and it's time to make sure that recipients of the funding understand their commitment back to the government to demonstrate that there's been improvement in the corridors.
Were you satisfied that when they started the program that they had that the government had a reasonable baseline? Because I noticed that what they were trying to achieve was improving the flow of people and goods in Canada, increasing the flow of trade in and out of Canada, help the transportation system withstand the effects of climate change. But improve and increase these numbers need to have an understanding of what the baseline is. If we're just adding a new airport, is that increasing? Did they have a good baseline when they started?
So we found that they used a lot of data over many sources and were well informed as they designed the calls. So this program so far has been rolled out with 7 different calls, and that each call targeted a specific need, whether it was seen as a bottleneck in transportation corridors or a gap when it comes to making sure that infrastructure is climate resilient. So they did a good job having evidence to support the calls, and then even having open and transparent criteria to select the recipients, like who would be eligible for the program. So it was well designed and well informed by data, which is different than what we're seeing in our Indigenous reports, where data is often not gathered and decisions aren't well informed. But in the corridors, it was a great example of well informed decision making.
How much time do I have left?
1 minute.
All right. I'm just going to jump just to the policing report just for 1 minute. In a similar, I don't remember exactly. I didn't know what paragraph that was on. But you said that the RCMP did not collect enough information to make a reasonable assessment as to the impact of it. Of the program. Were you able to reach out to communities and get their assessment? Because the RCP could come back and say, well, we didn't collect the information, but communities are generally satisfied with what's happening. Were you able to collect enough information to get an assessment as to whether this program was working or not?
I think if I point to a couple of the findings in our report, that the RCMP wasn't tracking, and one of the main requirements of the agreement is to dedicate a police officer 100% of the time to a community. Yeah. The First Nations Inuit policing program is meant to supplement core policing services that are already available in the province or territory, and that it is supposed to be proactive and community-based, so respecting the culture and the traditions of the community. They could not show us, there were very few, I think it was 38% of the detachments that could show us that they were tracking that a resource was spending 100% of their time in the community. But yeah, I think one of the more important things is many of the the positions that are funded were going unstaffed. In the last year, 61%. So even if we had reached out to those communities, there are communities where there's 61 police officers were expected to be across the country, and they're not there because of a staffing shortage. The issue isn't just about not gathering the data. While that's important, it's about also having the resources to meet the needs under the agreements that have already been signed between the federal government, the province or territory, and the communities.
Okay. Thank you. That is your time, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
I'll turn now to Ms. Yip. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Office of the Auditor General for coming so early this morning and tabling the report, and also for your work on these spring reports. I'm perplexed why there's so little progress in improving the housing conditions for First Nations, and why is it the fourth time that we are looking at the same issue?
I echo your sentiments. I'm rather discouraged that it's been 20 years and there is little progress despite the amount of money that has been invested. I would point to some of my predecessors. I would tell you that, Sheila Fraser at the end of her mandate said that the failures of the government in meeting the needs of First Nations communities was unacceptable. My predecessor, about 5 years later, said it was beyond unacceptable. And in my view, these strong words are just not driving the change that is needed. I'd like to see a fundamentally different approach taken by the government to address the issues, whether it be around safe drinking water, emergency preparedness, housing, or policing. The approach of being passive and siloed and having communities apply doesn't appear to be working. We have 2 decades worth of information to show you that it isn't working in the housing front. I think the other thing I would offer up is, while there was an estimate of how much money it would take and the effort it would take to close the housing gap in communities, Indigenous Services Canada and CMHC didn't have a plan on how to fund that long term. You don't need to fund that all in 1 year, but you need to have a plan to fund that long term to support communities to create the capacity to be able to build and repair. And that absence of that plan means that some progress is being made, but it's just not keeping pace when 80% of the needs still remain unaddressed.
You had mentioned that communities need to apply for funding applications. Why are some communities not applying? What are some of the barriers?
I think it really would depend on the community, but what we looked at was capacity and whether communities had a dedicated housing manager. And a housing manager in a community would help the community manage all their housing, identify issues, be able to have an understanding of the needs of rebuilds or repairs, the needs of mold. And without that, without having that knowledge, you're unable to necessarily apply for programs that may be available. But I think the approach of the government of also waiting for a community to put up their hand is one that isn't proactive. Being proactive would help increase access by making communities aware of funding programs that are out there and helping them navigate how complex it might be. Just to give you an example, under housing, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has 13 programs that Indigenous communities can apply to. First, you need to figure out which one you might be eligible for, but then you individually have to apply for the programs that you need. That's really complex if you don't have a dedicated resource or if you're not even aware of the availability of this funding.
So how can the government be more proactive or increase the uptake and participation in these communities?
I think when we talk about the fact that the department and the Crown partially agreed with one of our recommendations, and it was stemming on the approach that they're taking. And in my view, the approach is one that has just not kept pace with the commitments of the current government. In order to support reconciliation and self-determination, it isn't just about funding programs and providing resources. It's also about ensuring that communities create the knowledge, the capacity, and the skills to be able to take over some of the programs that are being offered by the federal government. And so it's focusing on that other side too, that need to help create the capacity and knowledge within communities that would hopefully drive a change. But that means that the approach to all of these funding programs needs to be looked at in a holistic way and find a different way forward.
I'm just going to switch gears, and can you explain how the First Nation policing program is set up?
Sure. So the First Nations and Inuit policing program was designed in 1991 and amended slightly in 1996. The program has mainly two funding mechanisms. Agreements, they're either called tripartite agreements, an agreement where the federal government will come together with a province or territory and an Indigenous community and to provide supplemental services to core policing services that might already be provided in the province or territory. The RCMP, under that agreement, will be the service provider, so we'll provide the policing services. The second major agreement would be a self-administered agreement where the federal government and the provincial government come together with the community, but the funding goes to an Indigenous or Inuit police service themselves. So it's the community themselves that are providing the police services. It's a cost-sharing program, which means that the federal government brings 52% of the funding to the table, while the province or territory will typically bring about 48%. The way it's set up is even if the federal government increases its funding available to these agreements, the province or territory needs to find their share in order for more money to be funneled to communities. So I think that's a quick overview of how it's structured.
Thank you, and that is the time. Maintenant, Madame Sinclair Desgagnés, vous avez 3 minutes.
Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés, you have 3 minutes. 3 minutes if you need them. Well, precisely. I'm going to give my colleague, Mr. Desjardins, take my time. He has a great deal to say.
Members went a little long, so you've got, it would appear, 6 minutes now. So over to you, please.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to address my next series of questions in 3 parts. Part 1 being the underfunding aspect that we find on page 10 of your report. Which region consistently had the highest proportion of housing units in need of replacement and major repairs?
Mr. Chair, that was the Alberta region. Alberta had 28% of houses in need of major repairs and 11% in need of replacement.
And how much did they receive in 2022, that region?
Mr. Chair, we have an average set out in Exhibit 2.5 over the period 2008 to 2023. But in 2022, or 2022-23, they received only 19 million.
Should the government have used correct information, not old, outdated census information like that we see in 2001, over 2 decades ago? Should they have used more recent information like the most recent census we just conducted? How much funding would Alberta region be entitled to?
Mr. Chair, as CMHC points out and we echo in our report, if the 2021 census data had been used, the Alberta region would have received approximately $140 million over the period 2008 to 2023.
And so, is it fair to say that's a deficit, a major deficit for housing that is on top of the existing costs that accumulate per year in additional persons, let's say, or even more repairs? We're simply just speaking about past deficits when you cite 140 million, correct?
Mr. Chair, just if the formula had been updated, it would have been $140 million more.
And is there any other program that you know of across the federal government where an older census document like that of 2001 is being used for formula production today?
Mr. Chair, I'm not aware of any other examples.
So this may be one of the only instances where we're using old information, old formulas, which results in a very real prejudice. Wouldn't you agree?
Mr. Chair, if the updated census data had been used, as we say in our report, the amount of funding that would have flowed to First Nations in Alberta would have been significantly higher.
And what do you think the impacts to not funding these projects are in your discussions with the departments?
Mr. Chair, it's a case of where in any particular region there are houses that need to be repaired or renovated, and if there aren't sufficient funds, not all of the houses that need to be repaired or renovated are repaired or renovated. And as we point out in the report, there's at any point in time about 19% of houses on reserves need to be repaired, and about 6% should be replaced.
Now, moving on to my second topic about Indigenous communities and the passive nature of the federal government. We've heard comments from the Auditor General in relation to the passivity of the government, and it's not hands-on approach to what is a really dire housing crisis across North America, most particularly in Indigenous communities. When we don't have active approach to these circumstances, it leaves, in some instances, smaller communities that at times in the report suggest that have higher need are receiving less. Can you describe how you came to that discovery?
So we decided to look at the smaller communities that had less than 100 housing units, and divided them between which had assessed that 75%, self-assessed that 75% or more of their homes needed major repairs or replacement. And we found that on average, those communities received less funding than the other communities who had self-assessed that they had lesser housing needs. And so it isn't an equitable allocation when you're not aware of the needs across all of the communities, and then you see those in most need not getting their funding. And I would argue that it goes against even one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of going to reach those who are furthest away and bringing them forward first.
No, thank you for that. And it's actually in the early 1980s, there was a famous elder from Alberta who said that the federal government's approach to supporting Indigenous people is much like that of a person giving bread. That the federal government requires an Indigenous person, at that time he used the word an Indian, to give him a piece, to ask for the piece of bread, and then he will break off a piece to determine how much. In addition to that comment, he said that the government only holds a few pieces of bread, forcing many of the nations to compete. This competition for a few dollars at the federal level results in larger nations that have more capacity having more access, and less capacity nations without a housing manager, for example, without anything. I'm reminded of that comment because that was in the late 1970s, early 1980s. He made that comment during the Constitutional Roundtable. It was a commitment by the government at that time that they would address that terrible approach. And at the resolve of those dialogues, and many elders across the prairie would remember this famous elder's comments, he said, we need to change the approach. The federal government cannot continue to hold the bread basket and ask First Nations to beg for it. It's time that they show us where the bread is made and make commitments to making bread together. What a remarkable contribution to ideology and dialogue that Mr. Daniels had at that time. And any other comments that you would like to share with us, Ms. Hogan, in relation to what kind of future you see for Canada-Indigenous relations?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think just speaking to your comment about the bread and making the analogy to funding, we did look to see whether there was an equitable allocation of funding. And you've previously asked questions about the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation using outdated data, which was missing 20 years of demographic changes, which obviously was, as we looked at it, wasn't resulting in an equitable allocation. But I would also tell you that Indigenous Services Canada's data, as we talked about around the homes, shows the communities with poorest needs getting less money. It is, I think that the focus was on giving funding to either shovel-ready or quick-to-complete projects instead of really assessing the needs individually. And that's why our recommendation to the both of them was to go look for and identify those communities most in need and make sure that they're getting their share in order to help them move forward. And in my view, it is a fundamental shift that is needed than this application passive approach that we're seeing right now.
Thank you very much. That is your time. Turning now to Mr. Nader, you have the floor for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I will just pick up on your last comments there. It does seem outrageous that, when it comes to something as fundamental as a roof over one's head, that, we're using old data. We're seeing examples of those communities in the most need are the ones who are getting the least funding. I mean, it really does seem just out of sorts that this is happening in Canada and in Indigenous communities. It just really does seem outrageous, and I just offer that as a comment. But it does flow from what we've seen in your audits here today about some of the real lack of documentation, real lack of data to support what's happening on the ground. And one of the things that caught my eye in section 2.49 of the housing report, in which 2.49 states less than half of the projects were sampled. Specifically, the department had documentation certifying that only 8 of the 22, 36% of the projects to build new housing units we examined met the building code standards. Similarly, we found that the department had documentation certifying that only 9 of the 22, 41% repairs to existing units we examined met building code standards. That seems like a real concern from my perspective, that when we're talking about building code, not necessarily implying that they didn't meet building code, but that there wasn't documentation confirming that they met the building code. Where did you see, or how did you come to that conclusion? Was it simply they just didn't have the documentation, or that the documentation wasn't readily available, or where did that come from?
Well, from a few things, I guess I would start off by offering up that poor quality housing is a contributor to the growth of mold, and hence why making sure that repairs and new builds meet at least the national building codes or a stricter requirement if communities would have those is important. It's a requirement in many of the funding agreements between the government and the communities. What the communities could ask for housing inspections to be done. But we saw that there was less than 1% of the new homes or builds that were being inspected. The communities told us about the lack of access to individuals who could do those inspections. But really, as you say, it doesn't mean that the builds didn't meet the codes. It's that the government doesn't have proof that that requirement within the funding agreement was being met. If I turn my comments to, I guess, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, some of their programs, when it came to repairs, did not require any of that proof, whereas new builds did require that proof. So it's about consistency to ensure that where federal money is going to be good, strong builds to help ensure that homes last longer and that mold doesn't begin to develop in those homes.
Well, and I think certainly the interconnectedness, if that's a real word, of those challenges where you see the mold, where you see the poor quality of potentially non-inspected or lack of inspections or lack of documentation confirming the inspections, it does all seem to be linked. And I think it is the challenge of having inspectors available to do some of those building inspections is certainly important. I think I have time to move on to very briefly on the First Nations Inuit policing program audit. And something that jumped out at me was in section 3.24, talking about the funds transferred to the RCMP and whether they're used for the program costs or other policing services. And you note that according to Public Safety Canada, the department last performed a review in 2018-2019 of RCMP expenditures to ensure that funds were used for the program. However, the department could not provide documentation of this review. This really surprises me that the department claims to have conducted a review but has no documentation whatsoever of said review. Could you elaborate on that? Was it simply the department says, yes, of course we reviewed it, but then there was no report that was provided, there was no paper copy of anything that actually happened with that review?
I mean, it's always concerning when we hear that something happens and there's no proof that it did happen. But I guess I would offer up that what's more concerning is that it hasn't happened since. Is that Public Safety Canada is managing the First Nations and Inuit Police Services program, and part of good governance would be to ensure that funds that you provide to a service provider, even if it is your federal partner in the RCMP, are used as intended. It's a good governance process that we would have expected to see happen, and it's one of the many reasons why we said that Public Safety Canada is really poorly managing, and there's some critical gaps in how they're managing the program.
And I certainly think this committee has had some experience with the portfolio under Public Safety Canada, and I suspect we'll probably be hearing from them again as we review this audit. So I thank you for your time today and appreciate
Thank you, Mr. Nader. Turning now to Ms. Bradford for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be sharing my time with MP Shanahan. First off, I'd like to look at the National Trade Corridors report. Your report indicates that Transport Canada has already improved its project performance monitoring. Was this change made before or after your audit?
The change was made during the period under audit.
And do you think the changes are enough, or do they still need to do more in this area?
Well, the changes are being incorporated into new contribution agreements. So the most recent 9 agreements that we saw included those new requirements. But the recommendation still stands that they need to figure out how to do it for all of their projects, right? There is a clause in all of the agreements where recipients need to provide performance and outcome and measurements. And given the long-term nature of projects to be completed, and as well the time it will take in these kinds of infrastructure projects to show that over time fluidity has improved, the Transport Canada has the opportunity now to fix that going forward so that they can gather better data and have a much more robust performance measurement framework in place.
Do you think they have a plan in place? Do you think, is there a tool or something in place that will address that?
So I might ask David to jump in on this, but they are at least improving. They at least changed their performance measurements and made them consistent across projects, and then I'll see if David wants to add to it.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So, Mr. Chair, during our audit period, we saw that the department was taking steps to improve the way they monitor the successes of their projects. And as we have in our Exhibit 4.7 is a list of the core, I would say, project level performance indicators that they need to put in place. As we just said, this work was applied, these new indicators were applied to 9 projects so far, but of the 116 that are currently underway, there are the rest of them, 107 that need to be adjusted to take into account these performance indicators. And really the impact or consequence, I would say, of this so far is that by not applying the project level proper indicators, the department has been unable to demonstrate basically the outcomes of the program overall because they don't have the information that they need to roll up from and show results for the whole program.
So due to the nature of these projects that go on for years, how does your office assess whether the department's doing enough in these areas?
Well, I mean, that'll come down to whether we decide to follow up on this as a full audit or, as this committee is well aware, we have an online database where we do follow up on past audit measures and recommendations. And so we might put that in there in order to follow up. But there will be years before projects are completed. Only 30 so far out of the 181 that have been allocated funding have been completed. So this is a real long-term outlook before you can see some real concrete improvements.
Okay, thank you. Brian, you want to take over?
Yes, thank you very much. And I just wanted to take a moment again to thank the Auditor General and her team for this overview of these three reports. I think we've all been struck by the fact that two of the three reports concern systemic, longstanding issues regarding Indigenous services. And I, for one, and I think I share that with other colleagues here, would like to see this committee devoting an important part of its time to studying these reports. But I did want to ask you, Auditor General, in the past we've had upwards of 7, 8, 10 reports tabled by your department at any one time. Why is it that we're only seeing 3 reports at this time?
So there are a few contributing factors to the number of reports that are being released today. As you know, in February, my office released a report on ArriveCan, and we have 3 more reports coming in May. We've spread out some of our reports that are typically all tabled right now in March in order to be able to respond in a nimble fashion to requests from the House of Commons to audit certain matters. And so there'll be about 7, if you look between February today and May, about 7 reports coming under my banner. And then I would tell you that we've devoted more time to environment and sustainable development work. The Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development in the past would issue throughout the year probably 5 or 6 reports. He is on track to release 10 this year. And so it's just making sure that we are focusing on important matters to Canada and spreading it out. So you'll see some of his reports next month.
Well, and I just want to say, Chair, to the Auditor General, thank you for that work. I think that the independence and the professionalism of your office is without par, and without the work of the Auditor General's office, we would not have the attention to these issues that we should have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Ms. Hogan, just a question from the chair, something I don't indulge in often, but I'm curious because I often will listen to these meetings and try to pick out what's unique. By design, your office does not comment on policy, and I think that makes a lot of sense. You're there to look at results. But your comments today suggesting that, or stating that we need to rethink, suggest the policy is not working. I'll ask you to comment on my observation. The policy is not working, so this would then imply that just doing the same thing over and over again for years ahead is going to result in the same, or is going to end up in the same results, which is more disappointment. Could you just address this, please? Because this puts us in a terrain that I think this committee has to consider, and lawmakers at large, of a new policy rethink when it comes to housing policy on First Nations communities. If you could just respond to that, please.
I mean, I'm sitting here after 20 years of findings from my office across 4 different reports and showing you that the housing gap persists. So it's clear to me in those 20 years, which is really an entire generation of Indigenous people, that the improvement in housing isn't concrete. And so it is time to rethink the approach. But I would tell you that it extends beyond just housing. There are previous audit reports that I've issued on safe drinking water, on emergency preparedness, on access to health practitioners, or on the First Nations and Inuit policing program. They all have the exact same model of being within a certain federal entity and a community needing to apply to multiple programs to access funding. And that isn't really supporting, in my view, reconciliation and self-determination, where you really need to understand the needs, the cultures, and the traditions of communities and tailor how you support them. It's not just about resourcing programs and providing funding, but also about ensuring that there's a transfer to First Nations communities. And we're not seeing progress in that transfer, at least through these 2 programs, towards self-determination.
Thank you. you certainly wouldn't say this, but I will, that one definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for different results. And I think you've proven today that after 20 years, that's exactly what we've been doing, and it's time for a look. I'm sure this is a topic that committee will be investigating. I thank you and your colleagues for being here today. I will now adjourn this meeting. Remind colleagues we're back at 3:30 after question period for our study continues on the Arrive Can. Thank you. We'll see you all later, and thank you again for appearing today.